Hey crafty friends, this is Renee Wilson. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're working on a fantastic project that includes ink blending, stencils and paste, and of course die cutting and embellishments. So let's hop right in. I'm starting by placing the 8.5 by 8.5 waffle flower crit mat onto my surface. Then I'm going to pull out the Simon Says Stamp A2 layers stencils and place it over my piece of paper. It's really great because it has registration marks to line up your A2 panel underneath. Then I pull my ink stand and I'm using Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated ink in the color Marine. I'm also using a Simon Says Stamp blender brush. And I'm going for a sort of ombre look where I want the panel to be darker at the bottom and lighter as we go up to the top. I'm using Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 110 pound cardstock here to do my ink blending. And although while I'm doing the ink blending it may look a little blotchy, the fantastic thing about these Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated inks is that they actually smooth out as they dry. So you'll see that even the finished product here will look a little bit blotchy, but then once we get to the stenciling part, you'll see how it's leveled out over time. Sorry for the shaking here. I'm also making sure to tap off my brush so that I get a soft, gentle blend. If you don't tap the ink off on the side of your project before going to paper, you can get a harsh, darker edge around the edge of a stencil. So that's why I definitely recommend tapping the ink off as you go to work and blend in your panel. Once I'm happy with the blend, I go ahead, put away my ink pad, and bring in a microfiber cloth to wipe the excess ink from around the edge of the stencil. I think it's good to do this before you remove the stencil so you don't get any of that excess ink onto the white portions of your cardstock panel. I also peel up my stencil here just to show you what it looks like with that nice crisp white edge. And since I'm going to bring in paste over top of this stencil, I actually want to wipe off the edge of the stencil to make sure that there isn't excess blue ink still hanging on in the corners there. I place it back down over top of the ink blended. I'm taking time to make sure that this is precisely lined up with the ink blended shape underneath, because this is what's going to protect the white cardstock when we come in over top with the paste. Bring in the Spellbinders Star Bright stencil and place it over top. I arrange it so that the stars kind of drift off into the upper right-hand corner. I'm then coming in with some delicate surface painter's tape stencil in the corner where it's not touching the grip mat. Then I'm pulling out some Cosmic Shimmer Luna paste. This is in the color Moonlight Pearl. You can't really tell until it's dry, but it is both glitter and pearlescent. It's a nice white color. I think that is really beautiful. It's one of my favorite pastes. I'm just using a palette knife here to apply it to the stencil. One tip that I have is when you have a stencil with many different pieces, like this star stencil, use a smaller palette knife and look at each individual shape when you're going across, just to make sure that you have an even layer, because in the larger stars, if you have lines or drag marks where you've pulled your palette knife across, you're going to be able to see those. But at the same time, you don't want to push too hard because you might end up with a little bit of paste leaking under the edges of the stencil. When I pull off the stencil, you'll see that I got a little bit of that here, but in the overall finished project, I don't think that you notice it. The other fantastic thing is that since we have the dried ink blended panel underneath, the ink isn't going to saturate into this paste, and so any excess paste I'm able to scrape off of my stencil and put right back into my jar. So you see I'm taking my time really making sure that all of the shapes and the insides of the stars look nice and smooth with even coverage. I think that it really helps your final product if you take just a little bit of extra time when you're applying your paste. Although I do tend to be a bit of a perfectionist, I think that the time really shows and comes across in the final product. So then I peel off my tape and throw it away. And one thing that's really important to know about working with pastes is that they dry really quickly and they do become harder to remove from your surfaces if you let them dry. So even though you won't see it in this video, as soon as I peel off these stencils, I go to the sink and wash them off and my palette knife immediately. But look as I peel off these stencils, peeling them off and getting the reveal is one of my favorite parts of using stencils and paste. And since I used this base layer stencil underneath, the stars only appear on the ink blended portion of the panel. So I'm going to peel it off here and show you what it looks like when it's wet, just so you have a little bit of a comparison. This is what the paste looks like when it's wet. And then I'm going to bring in a pink ink blended panel to show you that's already dry so that you can see how the pearl really comes across when it's dry. I just think that it's so fantastic. It has a little bit of a silvery look. While my stencil paste is drying, I'm going to bring in the Simon Says Stamp Oh Baby Words dies and go ahead and get my sentiments created. I love this die because it has both the shadow die and the very delicate Oh Baby sentiment. You'll see here that I originally thought that I was going to cut the shadow layer from vellum. However, once I had cut that out and laid it on my dried card panel, it actually was a little bit too busy with the stars underneath, and I ultimately cut out the shadow layer from white cardstock. But I left in the video here to show you that sometimes you change your mind. Once you cut something out, lay it on top of your project, see how it comes together. Don't feel like you have to stick with your first idea if things aren't coming together like you anticipated. You can always change your mind and pivot. So I'm using my Anna Griffin Impress machine to cut these out, and I wanted to just show you how delicate this really looks. Get fantastic impression. I think that I actually used a shim, the metal shim plate that comes with the sandwich here, but I just love this tiny font. What I will say is that gluing it together can be a little bit of a tedious task, but I don't mind because I think that the outcome is definitely worth it. I will say though, that little comma is so tiny, it's very hard to keep up with. So just make sure that you keep that in mind and keep a place where you can set that aside when you're die cutting. Ultimately, I die cut many layers. I die cut 2 white layers and then a colored layer for on top of the sentiment. I end up using a white base layer for the shadow like I previously discussed. Here I'm going to show you what I consider to be a little bit of a trick for gluing together layers of really intricate die cuts. Instead of putting little dots of glue or lines of glue on the back of these layers, I sometimes find that even when I do that, it does tend to spill out the sides when I press down and adhere the layers together. So what I found to be really helpful for not bending die cuts especially is to put a little bit of glue on a spare piece of cardstock and then take the die cut with your reverse tweezers and then dip it into the glue from the piece of scrap cardstock just very lightly. And then you can set it down precisely where it needs to go when you're layering the die cuts together. And I think that that really helps. What I'm showing you here is the depth and dimension that you create by stacking those layers together. I think that it looks really awesome to make this die cut really pop against the background. So the layers add dimension, which really adds such sophistication to your project. The pink cardstock color I'm using here is Tailored Expressions Strawberry Milkshake, and the blue colored cardstock is Tailored Expressions Gumball. I think they have fantastic colors that matched really well to the inks. Next, I decided that it would be great to stamp some sentiments on the inside of my card. I'm using VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and I'm using some sentiments from Honeybee Stamps called Inside Welcome Baby. I've adhered 2 of the sentiments from the stamp set to my mini Misty, and I'm stamping them onto some Neenah Classic Crust Solar White 110-pound cardstock that I've already folded into a card base. The card is stuck into my mini Misty using another waffle flower grip mat, and look at how sweet that sentiment is. Now my panel is dry, I'm going to bring it in and use one of the waffle flower A2 layer frames to cut it out. I want a little bit of white border around that ink blended panel, but I want to be able to pop it up on the card base. So after I've cut it out, I'm just removing it from my die cutting sheet here, and I am so thrilled with how this turns out. Highlighting the white border around the ink blended and stenciled panel shows how you've used your stencils together creatively and really shows off and highlights that focal point panel. I then come in with some Altenew foam tape to pop up this panel in the middle of my card. I'm only using 3 strips of foam tape here since I plan to deliver these cards in person, but if I was going to send it through the mail, I would probably use 5 strips just to make sure that this panel didn't sag at all once it was on the front of my panel. So I bring in my stamped card base. I have it taped shut to make sure that it's going to lay flat when I try to center this panel down. And I made sure that it was facing the correct direction, removed the backing from my foam tape, and then adhere this into the middle of my card. I typically just eyeball this, and I think that it's pretty centered. Now we're in the home stretch, so I bring in my sentiments that have been layered and dry, and I place them on the card to kind of figure out where I want the sentiment to land. I think that both of these look fantastic. I'm really impressed with how the cardstock matched the ink, even though they're 2 different brands. By the way, on the pink card, I used Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated ink in the color Carnation. I felt the sentiment could use a little bit more dimension to pop it up from the background since the background was so busy, so I brought in some small round foam dots from scrapbook.com. I had to trim some of them in half to make them fit behind the letter, and then put some art glitter glue on the adhesive so that once I stick it down, I have a little bit of time to wiggle it and straighten it out and make sure that the sentiment is exactly where I want it. I'm using my Spellbinders reverse tweezers to hold that sentiment. These are fantastic. They have a nice fine tip point so that I can get into those spaces on these very intricate dies. So once I've stuck that down, I have a little bit of wiggle room, like I said, to straighten up the sentiment, and I am just so thrilled with how this turned out. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. The dried paste in the light is just awesome, and the sparkle that you get and the pop of that sentiment with all of those layers and the foam adhesive behind it is fantastic. So then you can see I've spilt my embellishments all over my countertop here. I added some Trinity Stamps sequin embellishments that follow along the sort of trailing path of stars, and I am so happy with how this card project turned out. This video is part of a YouTube hop hosted by Valley Oak Paper. March's theme is New Beginnings. I've linked all of the other collaborators' channels below in the description box, and they're also displayed here on the screen. I encourage you to check them all out and see their take on the theme, New Beginnings. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to see you next month.